Well, good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Macedonia Baptist Church. So glad that you could join us this morning as we continue our study in the book of Esther. We're in Esther chapter 8, so if you want to take your copy of God's Word and turn with me to Esther chapter 8, that's where we'll be. I got a question for you. Can God use a lost person to fulfill His will? Can God use Putin to fulfill His will? Can God use the guy in North Korea to fulfill His will? Can God use the person in China to fulfill His will? Can God use a pagan king to fulfill His will? Well, the answer is yes. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 45, you're going to see a man by the name of Cyrus. We know him as Cyrus the Great. He ruled Babylon for 30 years. Persia. He ruled Persia for 30 years. He ended the Babylonian Empire. He was a pagan king in a pagan land. Not only did he end the Babylonian Empire, but he also made a decree that basically that the temple in Jerusalem be rebuilt, and Jews that wanted to go back to that, they could go back to their homeland if they wanted to. He gave them a considerable sum of money to go back and buy building materials. He gave them the sacred vessels that the Babylonians had taken. He gives them back to the Jews so they could go back into the temple to be used there again. Can God use a pagan king? Well, in Isaiah chapter 45, this guy Cyrus, the one I've been talking to you about, listen to what Isaiah says. Thus saith the Lord to His anointed. Well, who's His anointed? To Cyrus, whose right hand I have held. Now this guy was a pagan king. He was pagan as pagan can be. He comes in Isaiah 45 and says, to Cyrus, whose right hand I've held. God has held your hand, Cyrus. To subdue nations before him, and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, the Lord, who call you by name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel my elect, I have even called you by your name. I have named you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me. God tells Cyrus, even though you don't know who I am, even though you don't acknowledge me, even though you don't know me, I'm the one that's been holding your hand. I'm the one that's been helping you defeat your enemies. I'm the one that's been here with you all along, and you don't even know me. Can God use a pagan king? Yes. That's what you have in Esther chapter 8. In Esther chapter 8, we have seen this conversation between the queen, Esther, and King Ahasuerus. Now what we've seen is this. Esther again takes her life in her hands as she comes before the king, unsummoned, uncalled for, which is certain death. She comes in not only uncalled for, not only unsummoned, but she comes in crying, weeping, and begging the king. And you just don't do that. You just do not bring the king down. And we talked a little bit last week about how The first time Esther went before the king, Mordecai had to almost kind of persuade her, talk her into it. Because if you remember, Mordecai goes, Esther, don't think that you're safe just because you live in the queen's residence there. Don't think just because you're in the palace don't mean that Haman's edict is coming for you, because you will perish too. You will die too. Don't think because you're queen you're safe. Then Esther says, I'll talk to the king. Esther goes crying, begging, risking her life twice now to the king for these Jews, for people that she's never seen, that she's never met, that she's never talked to, that she'll likely never see, never meet, never talk to. She sits here and she's risking her life for these people, and we see the heart and compassion of Esther. She literally takes her life into her hands for these people that she don't even know. And she comes and she begs her husband, the king, is there anything you can do to reverse this terrible thing that Haman has planned? Is there anything that you can do to stop this edict that Haman has set in place? Well, that's where we are. And we're going to pick right up where we left off in chapter 8 with the response of the king. The king is going to talk now. He is going to respond. And when you get to chapter 7, you're going to see this. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. Well, his response to Esther's request. There's Esther. She has been begging, crying, pleading for the king to change this edict. And the king does exactly what we do to our wives. He does exactly that. He starts out by pointing out the things he's already done for her. That's just what we do. We as husbands. She'll come in and she'll say, our wives will come in and she'll say, hey, why didn't you? And you say, well, I took out the garbage. I filled your car up. I mowed the yard. I've weeded. And we've talked about that. Like we point out things we've already done. That's what the king is doing now. He is pointing out things that he's already done for her. Look what he says. He comes and he says, I've given Esther the house of Haman. He said, I've already given you Haman's wealth, his possessions. I've made you a rich woman, Esther. I've already given you his house, his wealth, his lands, all his possessions. I've already given them to you, Esther. And then he comes down and he says, and they hanged Haman on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. He comes and says, I've killed this guy, my trusted advisor, my buddy, the guy who I hung out with the most, my number 2, I killed him. Now, a lot of times we see on the gallows, we think of Clint Eastwood and the Wild Wild West. Well, that's not what it was in Persia. It was impalement. It was impalement. They would literally impale them, then hang them and display their bodies. Haman, he says, I literally impaled and then displayed the body of my buddy, my best friend, my number 2, my most trusted advisor, Haman, because he tried to lay his hands on your people. So he sits there and he tells Esther, I've given you wealth, I've given you lands, I've given you this house, I've given you the standing. I've even killed Haman and put him on display for people to see. All because he tried to lay hands on your people. Then you get to verse 8. Now I'm going to do something a little different in verse 8. I'm going to read the last of verse 8 before I get, and then go back and do the first. So when you get to verse 8, you see the last half. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. Esther has come and she's begged, she's pleaded, she's cried, she's begged for her husband to stop this edict. In fact, in verse 3, it says she fell down at his feet and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. She is coming. Is there anything we can do here? Is there anything that you can do to stop this? Well, guess what the king says? The king says this. He says, I can't. That's what he's saying in verse 8. That's what he's saying. He's coming. He says, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. That's what he's saying there. I can't do nothing about it. There is nothing I can't do about this. I can't help you with this. Honey, I can't do what you want me to do. Well, that is not the only example of something like this happening. In Daniel chapter 6, you've got a king by the name of Darius. And you've got all these people that are trying to basically plot Daniel's death. They're going to throw him in the lion's den. In fact, in verse 7 it says of chapter 6, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, counselors, advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or a man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Verse 8. Now, O king, establish a decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. They come and they say, you sign this thing, because once you sign it, it's law. It can't be changed. There's nothing anybody can do about it. Verse 15 of chapter 6 says, then these men approached the king and said to the king, now, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Ancient kings would claim that they would be gods. They claimed to be gods. They claimed to be a deity. So that kind of painted them in a corner about changing their mind, because then you would say God is wrong. Well, Xerxes comes and tells his wife, and he tells Mordecai, I can't change this. There's nothing I can do about this. Once this thing is written in my name and has my seal, nobody can do nothing about it. No one can revoke it. Now here's Esther. She's begged, she's pleaded, she's cried, she's fell at his feet, and he just tells her, I can't help you. There's nothing that I can do to change this edict that Haman wrote. Well, then that puts us back to the beginning of verse 1. God puts a thought in this pagan king's heart. God puts a thought in this pagan king's mind. Because he comes and he says, and he says this, you yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. He comes and he says this, you write an edict. You write your own edict just like Haman did, and then you seal it with your signet ring. Now this one will not change. This one cannot stop the one Haman wrote, because it's been sealed in the king's name, his signet ring. That's what you see. It can't stop it. We can't stop it. But guess what you can do? You can amend it. Guess what you can do, Esther? Guess what you can do, Mordecai? You can amend it. You can override it. You can add something to it. It can't be changed. That day of judgment for the Jews is happening, and that can't be stopped. But this new edict, you can amend it. You can override it. You know, that's kind of what our government does. You have this bill about something, and then all of a sudden you've got senators and all these other people that want to throw pork on a bill that has nothing to do with the bill that they're signing. We call that pork. They just want to throw it on there, right? It may be a bill on infrastructure, and they want to throw in something on, guns. It's just they just want to throw pork on it. That's what they're doing here. He says, you come up with your own edict, sign it with my signature, then it's a law. It can't be stopped. So, the king calls in his cabinet. He calls in his cabinet. He calls in all of his Congress. In verse 9, the king's scribes were called at the time, the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according all that Mordecai commanded. Mordecai gives this decree, his new number 2. Mordecai now gives this decree. It says, according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, to the satraps, to the governors, and to the princes and the provinces of India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. I love that because it makes me think of the Wild West there. They just jumping on a horse and rolling. Well, what you have here now is this. The king called in all these people. He called in all his scribes, and he said, Mordecai is going to give you an edict. The scribes write the edict on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, about 2 months after Haman's decree, and about 9 months till the Jews' day of judgment. Hence, the last part that I read you in chapter 8, where it says, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. They were 9 months. They had 9 months to get this new decree out there all the way from India to Ethiopia. Now, if you go look on a globe, go look on a map. India to Ethiopia is a pretty good ways on horseback. So they had to go through to 127 provinces with this new edict. They had to get going. They had to publish it in the language of all the kingdom of all 127 provinces, including the Jews. And then this edict you see was sealed with King Ahasuerus. He sealed it with a signet ring. They get going. They had to be ready. They had to do this because time's running out. They didn't have a 747 to jump on and just deliver this thing. They didn't have the internet. They had to do it all by horses. So they had 9 months to get this edict out. Well, what was the new edict that Mordecai wrote? What was the new edict? Well, you look here. You look here, and we're going to see this new edict that Mordecai wrote. Verse 11. By these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possession. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So here's the decree. The decree was this, that the Jews were allowed to defend themselves. They were allowed to defend themselves. They were allowed to protect themselves. And they were allowed to plunder. Now that's going to be important. I want you to remember that. I want you to remember that in verse 11 where it says, and plunder their possessions, because next week we're going to get in chapter 9 and you're going to see the Jews don't plunder. They don't plunder nothing. They don't plunder. In fact, 3 times in chapter 9 it says they did not plunder, they did not plunder, they did not plunder. Well, when you come to this, let me tell you what this decree did not mean. This decree did not mean the Jews could just go start a war. This decree did not mean that the Jews could just walk down any city street and just see anybody and just kill them. This decree did not mean that the Jews just were allowed to go slaughter people just because they liked their house or they liked their horse or they liked their job and they wanted it. They were just not allowed to go slaughter people. That's not what this edict is. This edict was written for the Jews to defend themselves. Now here's the thing. That seems to think that the first edict, the Jews wasn't allowed to. Because look at the wording here. In verse 11, by the letters the king permitted the Jews who are in every city to gather together and protect their lives. So does that mean on the first decree the Jews couldn't fight back? Well, that's the way I take it, that they couldn't fight back, that they were just not to rebel, not to put up a fight, not to do anything. Now they are allowed to gather together and defend themselves. They're allowed to gather together and defend their territory, defend their life, defend their family, defend their home. But this was not an edict that they could just go out and start a war, that they could just go out and slaughter people, that they just couldn't, just because they didn't like somebody, they could kill them. That is not what this edict is. This is self-defense. This is self-defense. They were allowed to come out and to protect themselves, to defend themselves against those that only attacked them. That's what this edict was about. That's what this edict was about. They were only allowed to fight only when they were attacked. Now, the king hurried it because he wanted the Jews to be ready. Hence the swift horses. Hence what we read before, the Jews' script being written in their own script, in their own language. Now, let me get to verse 15. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. You remember how I told you when we first started in Esther, you have all these U-turns. You've got all these reversals. Well, here's another great one. Do you remember the first time when Haman issued that edict of Haman? What did Mordecai wear? Sackcloth. And that first edict, how was the city of Shushan? Perplexed, confused. Now you have this second edict. Mordecai is walking out in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and a garment of fine linen and purple. And they look at the city of Shushan. They rejoiced and was glad. You just have this big U-turn here. Verse 16. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. These Jews had been under this dark cloud of death. They had had this day circled on their calendar, this day of death. Now the Bible says they had light. Now they had gladness. Now they had joy. And at the end of this chapter, a revival breaks out. A revival breaks out. The people, these Persian people, saw the working of God in the lives of these Jews. Think about this for a second. These Persian people sit here and they saw Esther, their queen, a Jew. They saw Haman, whose plot was to kill all the Jews on this certain day, hanged on a gallows, impaled on a gallows. They saw the king have a heart for the Jews. Why? What does he say at the beginning of chapter 8? I hung him because he tried to lay a hand on the Jews. And now Mordecai, a Jew, is walking around in royal apparel of blue and white with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. He's the new number 2. They have seen how God has worked in the lives of the Jew. The people saw gladness. They saw joy. They saw feasts. And they saw how God has protected these people. Look, God may not be mentioned in the book of Esther, but He is all over it. Now, they saw the light of God on these Jews, and they left their pagan gods and worshiped the one true God. These people were converting to Judaism by the droves in the days of Mordecai. Now, this is what I want to ask you. Do people see joy, gladness, and light in your life? Do they see it, joy, gladness, and light that you have for Jesus Christ? You know, we can show more joy and gladness over stuff that just don't matter, over stuff that we'll even forget about. You know, here probably in another month, I'm going to be in Neyland Stadium. And when Tennessee's playing, I'll be hugging people I don't know and giving high fives to people I don't know and screaming with people I don't know when the mighty big Orange score a touchdown. And they come, and I'm going to have joy and gladness over that. But you know, it means nothing. I'll forget about them beating whoever they're going to beat. It don't mean nothing. Do we show joy and gladness for what Jesus Christ has done for us? And do you show joy and gladness for what He's done in your personal life? How He's brought you through some things, how He's helped you navigate through some things in life. Have you had joy and gladness in your life that He's watched over you and protected you and provided for you? Do people see our joy and gladness over Jesus, or do all they see is our griping, our moaning, or our complaining? Our moaning and our complaining about the government, our moaning and complaining about the president, our moaning and complaining about our food is taking too long at a restaurant, our complaining about the waitresses, our complaining about the cooking staff, our complaining about gas is too high. Does all people see out of us as believers is griping, moaning, and complaining, or do they see joy, gladness, honor, and light? Because think about something for a second. That is all these Persians had to see. That's all they had to see. There was no tabernacle in Persia. There was no temple in Persia where the Jews could go and worship. What did they have to go on? Once again, the Jews had light, gladness, joy, honor. That's what they saw. That's what they saw. What would happen if people saw you smile? What happened if people would see us as believers being joyful? What would happen if they seen our gladness? What happens if they seen our honor? What happens if they saw the light of Jesus Christ? Because let me tell you what the Persians did. They saw that and they say, I want that. I want some of that. Folks, that's what the world will do if they see it in us. I need that. Especially nowadays. I want that. I need that peace. I want that joy. I want that gladness. I need the light. revival broke out in Persia. Revival. Many people of the land became Jews. They were converting to Judaism because of what God had done for these Jews in Persia. Well, thank you for joining us this week. If there's anything you need, please contact the church and we will pray with you. So glad that you could be with us this morning. Thank you and God bless. Have a